In that conversation with former CNN anchor Bernard Shaw, who retired last week. He discussed his career, the news business, race in America, and other issues during a forum Wednesday night hosted by George Washington University, Harvard University, and the National Press Club. Harvard's Marvin Kalb moderates the event. It's about an hour and a half.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and another edition of the Kalb Report, which comes from George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard. I'm Marvin Kalb, Executive Director of the Shorenstein Center office here in Washington, D.C. Last week, Bernard Shaw said during his last Inside Politics program on CNN, "There's a voice in here," and he pointed to his head, telling me it's time to go. And go he did. A 3-year career as a network reporter and anchorman, last 20 years as CNN's principal face and voice. He also worked for CBS, where I first met him, and also for ABC. Shaw has won just about every award and covered just about every news story, from to the Reagan assassination attempt, from the student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, to the Persian Gulf War, from presidential debates to election night 2000, when the networks proved and fallible that can all be. Shaw is a kid from Chicago who served in the Marines and converted his dream into a reality. He made it big time in the best and world of network television. He's also my friend, and I'm grateful that he has taken the time so soon after his retirement, he says, is stepping back to sit down and talk with us about his life and his career. So, Bernie, well, glad you're here with us. Bernie, during that same program, when you were asked why you retired from journalism, you answered, quote, "It's not worth it." And I think you were sort of setting up balance between the relevance of journalism and the sacrifices apparently to family life.
Yes.
Is that what you meant?
Well, I actually said what I meant. I said I was leaving at the time to go because I wanted to meet a Random House 10 years ago to write my autobiography. They've been waiting very patiently for the last 9.5 years, and I was over that. And I also want to spend with my my wife, and our 2 young adult children, Anil and Amar, and reflecting on the sacrifices they made. My 27th wedding anniversary, March 3rd. It's always been me, and my needs, mainly driven by the requirements of competitive atmosphere in the news media, and certainly the company I work for, going all the way to CBS, and then ABC, and then CNN. And I said, in retrospect, it wasn't worth it.
What did you mean?
On the other hand, that was how the family Shaw earned an income. So it was worth it, because it was helped their children. But on balance, I would say that it was not worth it. The hours
again?
I don't have a choice. That's that I can revisit. But on balance, when I think of our daughter, our son, and my wife made, I think about all the times, the really strategic moments in our young kids' lives I missed because I was out as the wage earner. When I think of the time that I've been away from Linda, unbalanced, I have to conclude it was not worth it. I know that sounds contradictory, but it was not worth it.
You retired, and there are anchormen who are still...
Don't ask me what I would have done.
No, but you retired, famous anchorman. And a lot of the other anchormen are still in their jobs after 15 longer years. Why do they stay? I mean, what's the impulse here? Is it money, stay in a job as long as all of the major anchormen have?
I can't speak for Dan, Peter, or Tom, but you've done something for a long time. If you love it, it remains compelling. And these are 3. And Jim Lehrer, these are superb journalists. Broadcast journalism worldwide has never had anger. There's no question. These men are journalists pure, through and through. But I wouldn't tend to say I know them, I like their friends, but you ask about Ego Honey, ask them. I can't answer that, but I do know they love what they do. And when a human being loves something, it's compelling enough to have them get up and do it day in and day out. You can hear them. They're going to respond.
Respond then to yourself and give us some sense. What happens to a person when everyone flatters them constantly? I mean, that's what you do. Does Linda tell you the garbage first thing when you return home?
She doesn't have to tell me.
You just do it.
Yeah, I do that.
All right.
But no, my way of keeping myself honest is to engage in a few things that are important to me. I don't like photographs. I don't like posing for pictures. I've made exceptions. Flattery does not flatter me. I'm always suspicious of flattery. It's my way of keeping myself honest.
Yeah, but at the same time, within the last week, there's been a party at Corinth. Everybody was there, I think.
You weren't there.
I didn't get invited.
Yes, you did. And Bernie was invited,
Bernie
too.
was invited, but you didn't get the other one.
Okay.
If it's difficult, not because I'm invited. No, but I'm trying to get at this sense of ego and how it affects journalism. Because what is journalism? It's the transmission of information as fairly, as quickly as you can. But does I need someone to become an anchor man? Because I wonder what that has to do sometimes with journalism. What do you think?
Well, when you think about the four people in the show, these men, even as they sit in the anchor chair, and who are anchors also, Judy Woodruff, my colleague at CNN, are journalists first and foremost. And just because they're behind a desk, they're not practicing journalism. When you're behind that desk, on the pages in Baghdad, or when I was in Tiananmen Square, I didn't have an anchor in Tiananmen Square. You are using every journalistic skill you ever had. The ability to write. You don't have a computer or a typewriter or a notepad. You're still writing. Some people call it ad-libbing, but you really are writing in your head. You're editing every day. It's live. But you're still writing as a journalist. So when you ask about ego, sure, we all have egos. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to survive in this business. But I have never been comfortable. It's my way of keeping myself honest because, as an anchorman, you have a responsibility. Viewers and listeners are giving you this precious thing they have, and that is their trust. When we do anything, then crush on trust. If they stop believing in what you say, what you report, you might as well take down your shingle. It's the other way. I don't have power.
Let's talk about television news on election night 2000. Why did the networks blow it so badly?
Because we were dependent upon a service we all subscribed to. In fact, we actually paid for the service. And it's other information flawed. So we inherited the same mistake. Does that give me and CNN cover? Absolutely not. I deeply regret having reported to the world, that Vice President Gore wins Florida. No, pulling back, it's too close to call. Governor Bush wins Florida. And even when I reported that George Walker Bush was the 43rd president, I said about 2:17 a.m. the Wednesday morning, that was wrong. So I take no solace that all my competitors made the identical mistake. But that's the basic reason why the mistake was made.
Now, let's explore more deeply about the mistake. The information from one source, that was the Vote News Service.
Yes.
It was set up by the networks in the early 1990s in order to save money. Each network used to spend between $5 and $10 million on its own polling operations. So you decided to save money. When you look back at it now, do you think that CNN was right in it, or CNN, the other networks, right in their decision that for the sake of money, it was separate the news they gave the people?
Well, in retrospect, I think all of the networks that were party to the formation, the funding of BNS were right up until the original was taken.
Could you see a little bit yourself and say that if you're all dependent on a single source of information, you're very vulnerable to that one source? You yourself wouldn't go on the air with a single source, normally.
I would not. But the question you pose has a purist tone to it, and it's not very realistic, Marvin. things are okay until you have a blow-up, a screw-up. And when you have one on that, then you second it. Then you go back and you try to find out what went wrong and try to ensure that it doesn't happen again. But from a business point of view, I don't think I would put much credence in the premise of your question.
From a business point of view?
Yes.
From your point of view?
Well, yes, from your point of view. You don't want to expose yourself to making mistakes, but realistically, every news agency, newspaper, radio, TV, wire service, is a business first. First. You don't believe it?
Well, I'm just asking you. You're the one who's in it.
I know, but you don't believe that?
No, but business requirements come first. That's what you seem to be saying.
No, I didn't. I said everything is a business. Now, if we're in the news gathering and reporting business, what comes first? Sure, we're journalistically driven. No question about that. You don't believe
But you were all, what you depend on a single source that I'm trying to make here is, it was a single technological source that, according to what you're telling us and what I've heard before, is that you are all dependent upon a single source. But what I'm saying, in the transmission of news, you would not be comfortable with a single source.
No, well, I think when you say single source, there's a difference. I don't want to split hairs with you, but in this instance, that was the source from which conclusions were drawn and calls were made.
But you all made the same call.
Yeah, but it's different when you're using sources to substantiate information you're about to report. In my mind, it's like I'm splitting hairs. One thing that we've done, we had some outside investigators, many of them with journalism backgrounds, who had the run of the network. They talked to everyone, and they came up with a very singeing and cold report and put in place several things that would prevent this happening again, including having a second independent source of data.
Except for exit polls. You set up, CNN is intending to set up its own VNS for them. I mean, in the old days, networks didn't need a VNS. They had their own operation.
Well, I can't speak for what CNN might do in the 2002 or 2004 elections, but we will have, regardless of what other avenues of interest we've been at CNN, a separate polling unit to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Okay, well, we certainly hope it doesn't. Bernie, CNN's management has undergone very significant change in the last couple of months, and there's even a story in the paper today about further changes in the management. And I remember on your last program last week, Ted Turner said to you when he came over to greet you, "I'm just a figurehead now." And I go back to your phrase for that is business. What is the impact of the collapse on business? It's not anywhere else.
It affects your advertising revenue, as we all know. But there's a firewall at CNN, and that has no effect on the journalism, on the covering news, reporting of news. Along with changes at CNN, we've also had the elimination of 400 jobs and a streamlining of processes, an elimination of redundancy and what have you. But we are still covering the United States, North, South America, and the world. We
As did with the 400?
I've not seen a diminution. I see it that way. Because I have to have stories happening in the near future that previously involved those 400 people to make a judgment about whether or not
Well, let's go back into the
things
past.
have changed.
Recent or otherwise, and if you could give us an illustration of the impact ratings or drop rating would have on news decisions.
I cannot,
You can't.
because
no
our
time.
ratings do not affect our news coverage.
You said if the ratings drop, the amount of money coming
The
in
amount of
drop,
money-
and then you end up firing 400,
Well, you are.
letting go 400.
Well, these people, in the judgment of management, had certain redundant jobs and have you. We lost some very good people, some of my friends, for years. And I have to put aside my personal feelings and just look at what happened. But companies always struggle. And our company, which has been bought by Time Warner, which well, and there's, but none of this has affected CNN's gathering and reporting. It simply has not.
Bernie, the new people who have taken over CNN as a result of the Time Taylor. The latest person I noticed, I don't know the man, I even forgot his name, it's like Jim Kellner or something like that. I didn't get any journalistic training. The people who run CNN today may end up being significant in their background and in their interests.
Well, they don't run CNN day to day. We have hardcore journalists who are in command at CNN.
Okay. Good.
The other thing is that CNN is a very important part of Time Warner.
I would think so.
And I don't expect, nor do the women and men who work at CNN, any kind of tarnishing, not only of reputation, but any kind of dumb down of what we do, or any kind of tampering with what's there.
Good.
Steve, Jerry Lynn, Tom Johnson, Bob Pittman, Dick Parsons, they all know he is the crown jewel in the operation.
Terrific.
They judge whether or not it results.
There'll be a lot of people.
That's us.
I got a number of questions that I want to run through. Yeah. National security issues. I said in your order of priorities, requirements of journalism trump the requirements, the feelings of one's journalist. That is to say, let's say that a general were to ask you a story. You know the truth. You have reported, you have it. You know it to be true. Because the reporting of the story might endanger American troops or hostages if they happen to be relevant to the story. And my sense of some of the answers you give is that the requirements of journalism will trump the requirements of nationality. Is that accurate?
You say nationality,
One's Americanism.
No, that's not at all.
Then explain what would happen.
No, I use the Gulf War as an example. As a journalist, I feel I do not have the right to report information, contingency plans, anything that would jeopardize the lives of people in uniform.
I'm not talking about contingency plans. Something happens. You know it. You've checked it out. You're certain of the validity of the story. A general comes to you. You're an anchorman. You're a very important guy. The general comes to me, says, Bernie Shaw, don't report the story. I know you've got. What would you do?
Or I would hope that my company and I would have the time to appeal to superiors and to the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States.
Have you ever done that?
No.
Fox had the story, and you were under tremendous competitive heat. Would it be different?
No, I would like to think that it would not.
What do you think is the outer limit of what you could report that are touchy-dicey and very sensitive?
Well, I would fall.
Rule of thumb, in other
I
words.
would fall on basic criteria. What would be served by reporting information?
Good story.
Does the public really have a need to know this information
They'd
now?
love to have it.
I'd want to be doubly certain of my sources and the solidness of the information.
You've checked it.
All those things would go through my mind. If I knew that this story would have a very short shelf life, meaning competitors also will be onto it, or you could hear their footsteps, that was a sweat. And all of these questions for you are hypothetical, so I'd have to be in a real-time situation to tell you what I would do.
No, but I was asking for you've never had a situation like that in your 20 years at CNN, where the government has come to you, as has been a number of times, for example, it is now known with the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Have they ever come to you and asked you, Bernie Shaw or CNN or Tom Johnson, don't run this story, it's too embarrassing?
Well, no, I've not. I've not had that compelling scenario that you just drew. I really have not.
Has a Secretary of State or a President ever called you and asked you not to do a story?
No, and I'd have to hear it before I would honor the request. And sometimes your government has very legitimate reasons for making such a request of journalists. And it's important that you listen very carefully. You to do. The people's right to know is hanging in the balance. And a couple times governments have lied and succeeded in delaying the running of a story. We know that's happened. No journalist worth his or her salt wants to be taken by anybody.
That, in a sense, what happened in the New York Times during the Bay of Piss, go all the way back to the early 60s, is a lesson for all of journalists.
Yeah. And you also have, on a different level, the Pentagon Papers.
Sure.
Not to mention Watergate.
You covered Watergate. Does that leave some attitude in your mind toward the government?
No, not really. I mean, you also had Vietnam. Between the two important developments in our nation's history, they did have an impact on how public officials and government itself are viewed by journalists. I was impressed with the fact that, even the President of the United States, if necessary, will lie to the American people. I thought that was the last time I would see that in my lifetime. But I was proven wrong by William Jefferson Clinton. Naive of me to have thought that Richard Milhouse Nixon would be the last person to lie from the Oval Office. I should have remembered these guys are human beings, and we know how frail we are and flawed.
But there are many of us and very few of them.
Yes, not only is this country strong, but it's great. It's great because of its people. It's great because of its values. And these strengths really stand us in good stead when you have dark moments. And the United States will always have dark moments, but the United States always will have a citizenry that will rise to the occasion. The American people are very wise. I talk to young writers all the time. I don't like adjectives. Just tell the story. A good story tells itself. You don't have to try to impress the readers, the viewers, or the listeners with it. Just simply report the information. Those people out there in this great land, they're very wise. I mean, look at the tolerance shown on election night in the next 30-some-odd days. Not one shot was fired, no riots in the streets. People got up, went to work, clothed, fed their children, educated their children. We didn't skip a beat, did we? And the rest of the world was wondering, what's going on with those dumb, crazy Americans? You know, why can't these guardians of democracy get their acts together? Well, we were getting our act together. It just took time.
Bernie, what would it count, given that burst of probably very justifiable optimism and enthusiasm?
Probably. I'm just twitting, you don't mind me. We're friends.
No.
We're really friends.
No, but why is it that fewer than 50% of the American people who could vote, the eligible voters, voted? That of the group 18 to 24, of whom there are many people in this audience, it was the lowest turnout in that group category? What are they saying when they sit home rather than participate in the activity that you describe in a very nice way? Why is that not enthusiastically embraced by these young people?
Because what they see in American politics is not real. Very little of what politicians talk about and very little of what they propose relates to lives of young Americans. Very, very little. All the campaigning done, and I'm not just talking about for the presidency, nor for the Senate or the House, but go to the state level, gubernatorial level, go to the city council level. For politics to be compelling, it has to be relevant to the people following politics. The emphasis is on what? Social Security, tax cuts, Medicare. You know, and if you're 17 or 18 or 21 or 23, you probably are not thinking about Social Security as a matter of concern right now. And when you look at bills being proposed by politicians, not to mention we in the news media, the horse race mentality we have in covering races, be they local, state, or national, there's very little discussion of the issues. It's appalling, the lack of discussion of international affairs or foreign policy in this last presidential campaign. I mean, think about that. The most powerful nation on this planet, and the two men who would be president of the United States rarely rarely talked about issues relevant to the American people.
Why didn't you ask them questions about these issues that were relevant then?
Well, when the opportunity presented itself, one did, but a campaign is a long campaign. And one of the reasons why, in fairness to the politicians and their campaigns, is that we have no major compelling challenge from without right now.
No Cold War.
No Cold War.
Bernie, let's shift.
There are several important silent wars going on.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about some of them. Let's talk about politics for a bit. Senator McCain said last week in some of the programs that I was about to say idolized. You know, that's not the right thing, though, because you don't like the word. But there's been an awful lot of glowing, and deservedly glowing reports on your retirement. Senator McCain said he doesn't know whether you are a Democrat or a Republican or a vegetarian.
Yeah.
So now that you're no longer sitting at the anchor desk, what are you?
It doesn't make any difference. I'm neither. You know, I'm
You're
neither.
not any of those.
No, intentionally so.
An independent.
I did not want any kind of psychological albatross that might potentially impede me from doing my job.
Did you vote?
No,
You didn't vote either?
did not.
Like Len Downey of the Post?
Well,
Len
It's
Downey
a
says he
matter
doesn't vote because
of
he
conscience.
doesn't want it ever to be, possibly to be known that he has a political preference. Is that roughly what you're
Well,
saying?
I didn't vote because I intentionally had no preference. I didn't want a preference. Again, so that I would have no difficulty whatsoever in doing my job as a journalist.
Were you able really totally to pull back like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've been doing it for decades.
That if a politician comes along, like in the last campaign, neither one of them moved you one way or the other?
I'm not looking to be moved. I'm a journalist. I'm covering these
No,
guys.
you're not looking, but didn't they move you anyway, whether you wanted to be moved or not?
I look at it very surgically, Marvin. I really do. I always have.
You're cutting out an appendix.
No, I don't mean that in vengeance or vengeful kind of way, but let's put it this way. My bosses have heard complaints about me from Bill Clinton, a Democrat, from Bob Dole, from Dan Quayle. I mean, Democrats and Republicans.
Ross Perot.
Ross Perot, I forgot him, thanks very much, constantly complain about me. So as long as the scales are even,
Then you're okay.
yeah.
Are you
As a
gonna-
reporter, I should tell you, I don't believe I have freedom of speech,
That's interesting.
unlike my fellow Americans.
Even now?
Even now, I have this ingrained habit that was formed for nearly 4 decades, so it's hardly likely that you'll see me hosting my own radio show where when you turn me on our television program, you get Bernard Shaw spewing his opinions about A to Z subjects. I'm just uncomfortable doing that. And I really don't think most people give a damn what I think.
Hey, very well be. So are you going to run for public office?
Never. Never.
Let me try it this way. Do you think that the appointment of Justice Thomas was a justifiable appointment to the Supreme Court?
If you were President George Herbert Walker Bush, yes.
Very good. Racism, which I have.
It permeates the air in our nation.
It does indeed.
And there's a reason for it historically.
The unfinished business of American democracy.
Yes. The mere way this great country was formed should have been a great semaphore flag to everybody. You folks are going to have problems for hundreds of years because of attitudes that were ingrained way back in the 17th century. You can legislate, you can write laws, pass them to change people's behavior, but attitudes take longer. And as long as generations pass down attitudes, I don't care whether you're white and you don't like people of color, and you don't like women, or you don't like, quote, foreigners, whoever they are, or if you're black and you don't like white people, I mean, we have black racists, we have white racists in our country. But laws do not change attitudes. That takes time. It takes goodwill. But the very way this country was formed, with people enslaved, and an economy operating as slave labor of people, that is why we have that today. I mean, one of the reasons, one of the greatest strengths of this country is its diversity. And well-intentioned Americans of all backgrounds, all religions, all colors, genders, are beginning to realize that this diversity is very important. It's our strength. And once we fully tap into that diversity, we're going to be a true power. And I don't mean in a muscular sense either.
Bertie, has racism touched you?
Oh, sure, of course.
Give me an example.
Racism touches me every day. When I see it inflicted upon fellow Americans, when I encounter it, because for a split second, instead of recognizing me as a prominent journalist, I'm seen as a massive black skin. I remember one day, there was a recent experience a couple of weeks ago. It'll come to me as we're talking, and I'll blurt it out, but I just can't think of it right now. But I remember once up in New York on Park Avenue, the Lowe's Hotel, that's across the corner from the big hotel, the Waldorf. I was waiting for my car, my driver, and I was just inside the vestibule. It was the outer glass doors. I was inside. And this guy got out of a chauffeur-driven limousine, and he had a briefcase. He obviously was coming in for a breakfast meeting. And I was standing there with my briefcase ready to go out. And he came up to the door, and he glared at me from outside, and he glared at me again. He thought I was the doorman.
You hadn't opened the door.
And he was glaring, wondering why I hadn't opened the door. And he continued to glare. And finally, he yanked the door open, walked past me, and bumped my shoulder. And I knew what that was about. Meanwhile, I'm waiting for my car. It hasn't come. And I stepped back in and asked one of the managers, has he seen my car? Has it been called? He said, Mr. Shaw, your car is coming. And this guy who had bumped me just turned around, and you could see the embarrassment on his face. But I've got a better example that will come to me in a moment.
Bertie, what did your mother and father do?
My father painted houses, and he worked for the New York Central Railroad, which on the Chicago South Side, we lived at 56th and Prairie, and the railroad yard was at 63rd, so the old man walked to work late at night and came back early in the morning, and my mother scrubbed floors.
Did they ever see you on television?
Mother did. When I was at CBS, of course, when I would contribute pieces to the Douglas Edwards Midday News and the Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Roger Mudd on the weekend, and they both did, and then when I was covering Latin America for ABC just before she passed away. But not CNN.
Too bad. She was very proud of what you've done.
Yeah.
What's it like for an Afro-American to be in the newsroom today? I mean, you've been there 30 plus years. Mm-hmm. Have you seen the changes?
Oh, sure. I mean, when I started, and before I started, this business changed because it had to, not because of the goodness of the highbrow thought of news directors and editors and what have you. Changed because of what was happening in the cities and the streets across this country. Urban America became a very compelling story in the 60s. We had riots, we had Watts, then you had the Kerner Commission report, named after the late Illinois Governor Otto Kerner, in which the news media, newspapers, magazines, radio, TV were studied. And they said there's a dichotomy not only in our society, but in the newsrooms. The newsrooms do not reflect the diversity of the United States as a whole, and this is very, very bad. People need to see their own reflections in the news media. So after the Kerner Commission report came out, city rooms and newsrooms across the United States, especially in urban areas, began to try to correct these problems. So I've seen changes in newspapers, in magazines. I've seen changes in local television, radio stations, and networks.
Have you seen the change in people's hearts?
Somewhat, somewhat. By the way, these changes in journalism are not enough.
What has to be done?
You have to have more diversity, and you have to have people of color and women especially in positions of power and influence, in decision-making positions. One good thing I see in local television, the number of women who are news directors, that number has gone up steadily.
Yes.
And that is a very positive development when it comes to local news stations, not just local, but network, where the network news departments covering certain stories. One of the great criticisms, one of the things that we are guilty of, especially in local television news, is the overemphasis on crime and how that affects the psychology of every American. I didn't say average American, I said every American. There's a reason why certain white people flinch when they see a black person, especially a young black male, anywhere. There's a reason why there's racial profiling and people are stopped in cities because they have certain colors. There's a reason for that. Part of it is the overemphasis by we in the news media on crime. And there's a little surprise in my mind, and nor should there be in the minds of a lot of people, why reporters or the news media are held in such low esteem.
Bernie, during a presidential debate in 1988, you asked Governor Dukakis a question that has been echoed through every journalism classroom since. And you've been asked about that famous question many, many times. And the truth is, I have been battling with myself for the last 2 or 3 days,
Really?
trying to find a way of asking you the same question. So let me turn it around and ask you that if your dear wife, Linda, I'm paraphrasing, were raped and murdered, would you support the death penalty for the person who did it?
Yes.
Absolutely. And when you ask that...
Provided he were still alive to receive it.
If Dukakis had answered the question in that way, you think he'd have won?
I don't know whether or not the race would have hung in the balance, but he certainly would have looked much better in that debate. That question
has been asked of you 1,000 times.
and for that matter, his answer, I don't think categorically affected the outcome of that race.
Right.
I really don't believe that.
But it did have an impact on journalism.
Well, I was doing my job as a journalist. The flood of hate mail and criticism I got from people who didn't like the question was driven by something that they really had forgotten. And it goes like this. Since when did a question hurt a politician? When? A question? It wasn't the question, it was the answer.
Absolutely.
And his staff had prepared him for that kind of question.
They knew in advance? No.
No, they did not. They didn't know in advance, but they had, you know how you sit around and you brainstorm, and it's just like the president preparing for a press conference. The staff will come in, and they'll sit around and say, well, you might get a question on this, or that kind of thing, because he had assaults in his family, you know, his brother, his dad. They say that he wasn't feeling that well the day of the debate, that he was running a fever, that he had the flu and all that, but all I can tell you is that after the debate, Governor Dukakis, after shaking hands with me and the other panelists, walked off stage, and John Sasso, his campaign manager, was waiting in the wings. And as he stepped into the wings, he said to John, and I cannot use this word, it's a very profane word, but it begins with an F. He said, John, up. But before we leave the subject, that was not a grenade across the stage question. I worked 2 days on that question.
No, I know.
That one question. The question was related to the issues of the campaign. George Bush had called him the Iceman twice in the campaign. Our polling showed that people didn't doubt that the governor was a competent public servant, but they didn't feel anything. And American voters like to feel something about their president. Capital punishment was an issue in the campaign. The famous Willie Horton ad was very prominent. And I felt that it was a valid question. The moderator of that 1988 debate at Pauley Pavilion at UCLA, as moderator, I only had two questions that I could ask, one of the governor and one of the vice president. I felt that the question I asked Vice President Bush was very tough.
Which was that?
Well, it went to an issue. What was a prime issue in the campaign? Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana. Who is he? Is he competent? You know. And the question I asked the vice president was rooted in a section of the Constitution. When I was trying to come up with a question that was relevant to Mr. Quayle, there's a section of our Constitution that says, if the president-elect shall have died before, and I'm quoting the language, if the president-elect shall have died before Inauguration Day, the vice president-elect becomes the next president of the United States. And I asked, what do you say about, I think I used the word specter, I wanted to reflect again the doubt. The difference in the way the two men handled each question was that as I was asking the question of the vice president, when I said, if the president-elect shall have died, Bush said, Bernie, which interrupted me. The audience had the kind of reaction you just had here. When I put the question to the governor, he did not think about the question. He had a response within less than half a second.
Yeah, it was very fast. Bernie, is there any limit to any outside boundaries to the kind of question that a reporter could ask a politician these days?
Well, given our atmosphere now, you'd almost be hard-pressed to come up with limits. But personally, as a reporter, I'm not interested in a politician's personal life or politician's sex life. But I can assure you that my network would be reporting like its competitors if there were something out there that everyone else picked up and ran with.
So that you would participate because, what, you felt you had to in the reporting of a politician's sex life?
Sometimes I would have no alternative. If my network is carrying this story, obviously at some point I'm going to brush up against it on Inside Politics or elsewhere.
That you don't like it deep down, but you do it if you had to.
I think so.
Bernie, in covering the many stories that you have in your career, was there ever a time when you wished you weren't there to cover it?
Not for professional reasons, but for personal reasons, because I didn't like what was happening. China was very compelling. We'd gone there to cover a very important summit, which most people forget. Here was then General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev getting off the plane to meet with Deng Xiaoping. The Sino-Soviet split was really causing all kinds of problems, not just in that part of the world, but for us. And their settling their problems would have been very good for Washington. Better to deal with one enemy in one capital than two. I won't carry the scenario to the ultimate end that went down in the minds of our security planners, the people in the State Department and the Pentagon, but the United States says it wants to be able to fight a two-front war, a war on two fronts. And if ever there were the possibility of that, you had it with Moscow on one side and Beijing on the other. But anyway, these two leaders got together, and we were there to cover the summit. Well, while they were meeting, these demonstrations in the streets were getting larger and larger and larger. They'd gone from 200,000 or 300,000 to 1 million people a day. No exaggeration whatsoever. Every day, 1 million people in the street of Beijing. Imagine that. It became more intense when middle-class people, doctors, lawyers, nurses, were joining these kids. And it got so bad that Gorbachev had to be sneaked into the back door of the Great Hall of the People. And then things deteriorated. And then the Chinese government realized that we were reporting more emphatically on what was happening in the streets than what was happening with these diplomats. Then finally, they walked into our control room, 2 foreign ministry officials, and said, you must cease, you must stop your live transmissions around the world. And if anybody looking at me now or hearing my voice can think of the worst thing that could happen to you personally, think about that for a few seconds. Here I am, a child of democracy with my colleagues, and a government official is in your control room telling you, and effectively the Chinese wanted to blind the world to what was going on. President Bush was at Kitty Bunkport, and the Secret Service called him down and said, we think you ought to come down to the guardhouse. That was the only place where they had cable at the time, and he was watching this and issuing statements on behalf of the United States government saying, we hope the Chinese government will show a restraint. You remember that? Yep. And meanwhile, we are trying to buy time to stay on the air as long as possible. And it's clear the Chinese government is going to shut us down. And I had asked people to go out and be on the alert to let us know the instant you saw Army trucks and troops rolling up to our hotel, because you knew what that would have meant. But when finally we had our last 2 minutes, 1 minute on the air, I could just feel this chill down my back, and I began to shake to think that this could happen. That was an instance. I was glad we stayed on the air, I think, for more than 30 hours, but then, of course, once they shut us down, within a day or two, you had the carnage at night. You know, and there were great stories about human beings and courage. The general in charge of the army in the ring around Beijing had a daughter who was demonstrating, and he refused to go in. You remember the pictures of people in Beijing, actually mothers scolding these troops on the truck saying, don't do this to your brothers and sisters. They turned around. That was a phenomenal thing to see, and we got all of that captured. We were able to report that to the world. The old hardliners in government had to go outside the military district of Beijing to get hardened troops who would come in and really crack heads. And of course, the world will never know precisely how many people were slaughtered. That story I wish that I could have been away from.
Yeah. Bernie, I have one
Pardon me for taking so long.
No, that's all right. It's very interesting, in fact. I have one more question, but I will ask that question, but just I want to take this time to invite those of you who would like to ask a question to come to either one of these 2 microphones over here. And please, you're more than welcome to do so. You come to the microphones and then ask your question, and that will be fine. Meantime, I will ask my final question, which has to do with journalism. And as you indicated a little earlier on in response to another question, that television news today is not exactly the most respected branch of journalism, and all of journalism, for that matter, is having its problems. And there is a general disgruntlement on the part of the American people with what it is mostly that they see. So it mostly has to do with television. They don't feel the same kind of anger, according to all of our studies, toward newspapers and magazines. So from your own experience, what must television do now, television news do now, to try to recapture some of the allegiance, some of the respect, some of the esteem that has been lost over the last 10 to 15 years?
I don't think billions of dollars have to be spent. I think women and men who populate television news, be it local or national or international, simply have to go back to the basics and really report on some things that are really rather dull, but that are very basic to our infrastructure as a people.
Like
school boards, basics, information that a community needs. The American people, any people in a democracy, but certainly in an industrialized country, are very hardworking. And they need certain basic information to do their jobs as citizens. I'm not talking about sexy stuff or sexy stories, just the basics. And I don't buy the contention that some network executives have that news about Washington is dull. I do not buy that at all. Because what the Congress does here, what the executive does here, is very important to the American people. The American people invest blind faith in the people they elect and send to this great capital city to do their business. And I think what happens here should be reported in detail. And on local stations, of course, things that happen in the community are very important. I do not believe you have to jazz up the news. That's one of the problems.
Jazz down the news.
Well, not jazz down, but just do the basics. I don't think
Right.
it requires an expenditure of billions of dollars. And I happen to believe that the American people really don't care whether a blonde is delivering the news or the weather. Although there are companies that hire themselves out to networks and local TV stations and whisper to them and say, you really should be going after young people. You want young people as viewers. They spend more money, so therefore you should have a young blonde, a young black male, a young this, and a young that. I mean, that is very insulting. Very insulting.
And yet almost every single local station does exactly that.
Believing that you know whose problem it really is. If you don't like the news media, if you don't like what you see on television, you are the problem. You're the consumer. You have the ultimate power. Believe me, news directors of radio and TV stations, editors and publishers of newspapers and magazines, and executives in these media empires really are afraid of you. You have the power, but you, for some reason, don't use it. I think one of the reasons you don't use it is that you're very busy. You're leading very complex, very complicated lives, and you're all living too fast, as are we, and you ignore the most basic power you have. That is the power of a consumer. If you're getting a steady diet of crime or sleaze, if it's affecting your kids, the music they listen to a great extent, you have yourselves to blame. We have ourselves to blame because what? You haven't complained about it. You haven't physically complained about it. If you ever did, I think you would be amazed at your power, and it might go to your head.
Okay, let's start. I'm going to start here on the left and then go to the right. Please give us your name. If you're a student, let us know. Ask a question, don't make a speech. And I'm going to ask Bernie to please give relatively brief answers because we got a lot of questions. Please start.
Hi, my name is James Capo. I'm from the George Washington University. My question is, during the Gulf War, Mr. Shaw, the United States military, from my understanding, gave you safe haven out of Baghdad. And when you returned to the United States, they approached you, the Pentagon approached you and asked to debrief you. And it's from my understanding that you did not wish to be debriefed by the Pentagon. My question is, why did you choose to do that?
James, the United States military did not give me safe haven out of Iraq. What happened was, I left Baghdad and took the 16-hour drive over dead highways and roads into Amman, Jordan. John Holloman was in a car. We had about a 3 or 4 car caravan. And we got safely to the border with Jordan and went into Amman. When I walked into our newsroom, which was in the Philadelphia Hotel, of all names for a hotel in Amman, on the 5th floor, I walked in, and the first thing I did was walk to a phone, and I called my wife, who was at home in Maryland with our children. And one of our ranking producers said, that fellow over there has been waiting hours for you. He was a man in civilian clothing. He was an American. And I went over and introduced myself. And he was an intelligence officer from the United States Army. And as we shook hands, it was like an E.F. Hutton commercial. About 23 people in that office were Jordanian nationals who were very fluent in English, some of whom were related to the royal family, the very royal family that supported Saddam Hussein. And he said, I would like to talk to you about what you've seen and heard. And I said, Colonel, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I cannot talk to you. I am not a combatant. I'm a journalist covering this war. I did not also say to him, although I should have, but it was going through my mind, do you really think I'm going to stand here, everybody in the room knows that you're an American intelligence officer, and talk to you when I have CNN personnel whose lives could be endangered? If I'm seen or thought to be informing one side in this war? But he said, well, if I talked to Ted Turner and he told you to talk to me, I said, Colonel, even if Ted Turner ordered me to talk to you, I wouldn't talk to you. I said, come with me, please. We walked over to the same phone through which I talked to Linda, called Atlanta, and got Ed Turner, who's no relation to Ted, on the phone. He's one of our senior-most executives. Ed Turner used to be a news director here at WTDG a long time ago. Some of you might remember his name. Very calmly, by this time I'm seething, very calmly I said, Ed, I have next to me a United States Army colonel who is an intelligence officer who wants to talk to me about what I've seen and heard over the past few days. I have told him that I will not talk to you. And I said, I will put him on the phone. Their conversation lasted less than 90 seconds. He hung up the phone. We shook hands. He left the workspace. James, that's my response to your question.
Good. Good question and good answer. Thanks, Bernie. Yes, please.
I'll try to be briefer.
My name is Michelle Dixon from the George Washington University. I wondered if you could give me any insight into what sort of criteria the news networks and you as a journalist make in deciding what to cover. For instance, what sort of standards were used or what other factors went into the decision to cover the O.J. Simpson trial in the midst of the Rwandan massacre, which got hardly any coverage?
Well, with the O.J. Simpson trial, it was a compelling case because of the principles involved, and there was no way that that trial was going to be undercovered. With the Rwandan massacres, CNN covered that story extensively, but that's because we have an international network that's devoted almost entirely, exclusively to international news. But the fact is, most Americans in this country don't care about, quote, foreign news. We are very happy and a very satisfied people. We really don't care that much about the world unless and until our interests are involved, economically and certainly militarily. And that's true for most newspapers in the United States. Fortunately, we still have about 12, 14 great newspapers that cover news stories that they know are important, whether their readers like them or not. And that attitudinally is what we do at CNN as best we can. But there's a woeful disinterest in international news. That's why the Rwandan massacre did not get the kind of coverage that the O.J. Simpson trial, for instance, got. And not just Rwanda, what's happening in India. The interest in India and Pakistan became obvious when it was clear that they were on the brink of war. And the United States had a vested interest in seeing that that not happen. I've always said that as an American, in my judgment, one of our greatest curses are those two bodies of water called the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Because what have they done? They've been a buffer. We've not had to worry about or involve ourselves in learning other languages other than Spanish. Our northern neighbors speak very good English. Our southern neighbors speak Spanish, but fortunately they're not a threat. If we had contiguous borders, it would be great. It would make us become more involved in the world. It's just a personal thing that I've always regretted.
Good point. Yes.
My name is Ben Stetler. I'm a sophomore at the George Washington University
Hi.
in the School of Media and Public Affairs.
Okay.
My question for you is your concern or opinion regarding the growing lack of competitiveness of media companies, whether media companies be merging with one another, such as the Tribune of Chicago and the LA Times under the same ownership, Disney and ABC, CNN, Time Warner, and AOL. What do you think the impact of that will be for journalism and for media corporations, the competitive nature in the future?
Oh, I think the level of competition is soaring off the register. It's not lessening. It's very cutthroat and very vicious. But I think as long as these companies hew to the standards they claim they're going to hew to, as long as they keep the seasoned professionals they have, I think the consumer of news will be well served. And if they're not, you will know it almost instantly.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah Brahim, and I'm a student at George Washington University. In light of the recent school shootings and the situation in Columbine, do you feel that those in the news media take into account the psychological impact that their broadcasts will have on children? When do ethics come in behind the news desk, and do you feel that this should be taken into consideration in the future?
Thank you.
Yes, I think they do, to the extent that it can be done in that kind of chaotic atmosphere where you learn that there's been a dreadful shooting at a school, and you have a responsibility to inform your audience, be they, well, listeners and readers and viewers primarily, because newspapers haven't come out yet. In a fluid situation like that, you really are depending on school officials and police authorities to inform you. And if they, namely police authorities, ask you not to report certain information, such as we found that the shooters at Columbine might have been watching local coverage of what was going on and adjusting their movements inside the school, I mean, we quickly learn how to adjust to the situation and generally responsibly abide by the authorities and what they're asking us to do. We certainly did that in the 60s when it came to covering riots in cities. The networks learned very quickly how to adjust to situations, especially during the civil rights movement when the networks were covering the South. I don't detect any desire to exploit a situation like that. As for the impact on children, I'm not trying to be flippant when I search for the right words to that part of your question, but I think children are hard-pressed to see the difference between the violence they get on television and in movie cinemas and the reality of a Columbine or the shooting in Los Angeles. It has a dreadful impact on children. But we cannot censor and not report it.
There is a feeling, Bernie, that there is on the part of many of the cable networks particularly, and the radio stations and talk radio and talk television, that in fact this kind of a dreadful situation is exploited, and is exploited for purely competitive reasons, that there is a desire on the part of one of the networks to try to best the other with scenarios that are more outlandish and outrageous than what has just been said. And it leaves a residue of distaste, I think.
As it should. As it should. You use the word exploit. I would say cover.
I would say exploit, but let's look. Yes, please.
I'm Cass Burnett. I had a radio program in Hawaii in the late 60s and early 70s. During that time, there was a sanctuary sponsored by Quakers and Unitarians and Peaceniks near the University of Hawaii. And I never saw it in the straight media. Do you have any awareness of it, and was it reported? People coming for R&R to Hawaii from the Vietnam War would not go back and would take sanctuary there in Hawaii.
Thank you.
Well, I was based at Marine Corps Air Station at Kaneohe for 2 years, and when I was in the Marine Corps, I really was concentrating on my duties there. But I do know that people from the war came back, and they did take R&R, not just in Hawaii, but elsewhere, closer to the Asian theater, but I'm not specifically aware of that.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, please. We've got about 3 or 4 more minutes, so please bear that in mind as you ask your questions.
Hi, my name's Mamta Jain. I'm a journalism student at the George Washington University. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you faced racism during your career, and I wonder what advice you can offer to aspiring journalists that are of minority descent.
Well, the reason why there still is racism, and you have to remember, it's not blatant racism. We Americans are much too sophisticated when it comes to dealing with one another. It's cloaked in many ways, and one of the ways it's cloaked is that in journalism, a lot of decisions are very subjective in nature. If you're an assignment editor, and the three people standing behind you in that line were working in the newsroom, and you decided you wanted to assign one, and only one, a certain story, and the other two complained to you, you could justify your decision. And it could be because you don't like the guy behind you and the young lady behind him for whatever reasons. But professionally, you could justify that, even though you might have had less than professional reasons for assigning it to a particular person. But my attitude was, I'm going to answer your question. And Marvin, I'd be willing to sit here and answer the questions of the people who are in line, but no more. Because you said 3 minutes, but we've got 2, 4, 6, 7, 8. And I promise to be briefer. Okay?
If you are willing,
okay,
my sires, speak away.
All right. Now, you said, what advice would I give to people, young people, who might encounter racism or sexism?
Racism or sexism, I guess. Within journalism.
Within
the
journalism.
industry, right.
Never accept anything that deters you from what you want to do. Never accept no. I was born in 1940. I grew up in Chicago. When I was 13, I had in my head that I wanted to be just like the man I would see on our little circular 12-inch Zenith television, our first television set. His name was Edward R. Murrow, and later there was another man named Walter Cronkite. And at that time, not only was there not a black person on Chicago television, there was not a black person on network television. The color didn't matter. I wanted to be a world-class journalist. News is not white, news is not black. White is not right, black is not wrong. Were there obstacles? Sure. But after a while, if you have a goal, obstacles don't mean anything to you. Obstacles are mere challenges.
Washington University. My question to you has more to do with any observations that you might have been able to make, especially in view of all of the buyouts of media outlets by some of the larger corporations and the effects that it may have had or you might anticipate them having on news coverage, not only on the coverage itself, but on the actual stories that are covered, and unbiased as you might try to be, some of the slants that might be taken, maybe not by the journalists themselves, but perhaps by the new bosses on high.
Well, I assure you that the women and men who are the professionals who people newsroom are very particular. And they refuse to be dictated from on high. A lot of people don't believe that. They don't believe that because of with the billions of dollars at stake that people can be so independent-minded and so prideful of what they do that they're not pressured. But believe me, we're not. And if that ever were to happen, the professionals would leave. These companies that are merging with one another know they're being watched. They know they're being watched very closely. They are businesses first and foremost, a point that we sparred with when we first started. But they take pride in their journalistic operations. And I don't think there'll be any diminution in what they do. In fact, the competition is only going to increase. The one regret I have is that whenever two companies merge, there are going to be layoffs, and good people are going to lose their jobs. That was the regret I had about CNN. We changed the economics of television. Our competitors, ABC, NBC, CBS, found that we did more even though our news budget was a third what theirs was. That's why the other networks started cutting back domestic and international bureaus, and that's why to this day, to this moment, there are some brilliant men and women out of work because of economics.
My name is Rick Bailey. I used to be a student once, I think, but my question is, I'm with a small nonprofit organization, very small but very controversial in the rural western U.S., and we recently cut off a local newspaper, a small town newspaper, because of their consistent misrepresentation of us and what we felt was an agenda. And my question to you, Ms. Shaw, is putting yourself in the shoes of a source, would you ever do that? Would you ever cut a journalist or a journalistic institution off? And if not, why not?
You lost me when you said putting myself in the shoes of
You're the source. You're no longer the journalist, you're the source.
Yeah.
And if you felt that a particular journalist or an institution, a newspaper, a network, whatever, was consistently misrepresenting you and you felt like they had an agenda, would there ever come a time when you would say, we're not talking to you anymore?
Oh, of course. Naturally.
Thanks.
You feel no, obviously you were being abused. Yeah, and you were being used. Well, you said a controversial group, but you didn't mention the name, but oh, that's okay.
I will.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's okay. That's okay.
We really are running out of...
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Hi, Lisette Olmos. I am an alumni of School of Media and Public Affairs, and I work for National Public Radio. You said a strength of our country is in its diversity. Can you comment on the lack of diversity on the networks and what you think needs to be done? The organizations have come out and the networks have created a position vice president for diversity. Do you think more needs to be done? And also, what other programs maybe networks need to look at in order to hire young professionals coming out of college to give them more opportunities?
Well,
and also, following up on that, I'd like to know if you're planning on working on any projects with your wife.
With my wife? Yes. Let's do the hard part first. Yes, we're going to be doing some things at home. We're going to be spending more time together, traveling and reading, but nothing beyond that would I care to talk about. But on your point, yes, there should be more diversity, and the networks are trying. There's much more diversity than existed 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it just isn't enough. There are some very talented young people. One of the things that really used to just infuriate me when I was 17, 18, 19, and when I was in college, every company, everybody would say, we want talented young people. But they never give talented young people an opportunity. And part of the reason is you constitute a threat because of your obvious, however raw or rough talent. So you should keep that in mind when you find doors closed in your face. It's not all because of your lacking of experience and polish. But again, never accept no.
My name is Kim Migas, and I'm a freshman at the George Washington University. My question to you is, as someone whose life has been a part of the fabric of the nation, and your report's part of the psyche of at least my generation, for one, what is an American? From your standpoint, someone who's traveled the globe, has that changed since your first report? And if so, how can we define ourselves today?
An American is a person who has been kissed with the citizenship of this country. And whether you were born on these shores or whether you came and became a naturalized citizen, it doesn't matter. An American is a person who has been kissed with the citizenship of this great country. I was a history major, and I take the broadest view possible, generally. And there's always this attempt. Human beings don't like complexity. Human beings don't like things that are open-ended. Human beings like things that are, and concepts that are black and white. Gray just drives human beings to distraction. And when those human beings are Americans living the fast-paced lives we live, we have short attention spans, and it's easier to stereotype than it is to think. It's easier to generalize than it is to see and think about the particular. So I don't buy these sweeping judgments about Generation X and Y. That's a little bit too glib for me. I still think the basics drive this country and hold this country together. The basics.
And I'm a sophomore at the George Washington University. My question to you is, you have mentioned a couple times in the room that you recommend that you don't take no for an answer, and you kind of go for what you want to do. There are a lot of students in this audience, I assume, that are going to go out and take journalistic careers. And what do you hope, as you're kind of closing the door to your career, that you, as you look out on this audience, what do you hope that we, as students going into the career, never forget about the career?
What I hope students going into career never forget. Never forget your basic self and the values that have propelled you thusly. And don't forget the things that you've learned from your parents and your background and your school, your alma maters for that matter, that are very basic. They're always the bedrock. Always the bedrock. Believe in yourself. Don't accept no for an answer, and know that you're going to have a damn tough time getting to the top, if indeed you ever get to the top. The women and men occupying the prime jobs in any field of journalism don't readily give up those jobs. I'm committing anchor heresy by giving up my job. But whether it's being an editor, an on-air reporter, a producer, a camerawoman, cameraman, whether you're working on assignments or long-form documentaries, the very people you want to supplant, you can barely move them. They don't give up the jobs. The best jobs are held by the best people, generally, you hope, and they stay in those jobs. It seems like forever. In effect, with all your talents, you're taking a number and you're standing in line. But that's the way it is. It's a pyramid. But never forget who you are and never sell out. And there'll come a time when your very principles and beliefs will be challenged. And a lot of times you won't know that. It'll be camouflage. And group psychology might come into effect. Well, everybody says, well, let's vote on it. But what if you know in your heart of hearts that this very vote is revolving on something that is either morally or ethically wrong, and you go along with it just to be liked? The moment you do that, you've compromised one of the most basic parts of your life. Never compromise your principles. You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Charlotte. I'm a sophomore at George Washington University. My question to you is, in your career, you were faced with a lot of challenging events to cover. Which one was the most difficult for you and why?
Which one was the most difficult event for me to cover and why? Well, I wouldn't say it was one. I would give you a menu. The Gulf War in Baghdad, one of the most infuriating things was that in all of this hell that was breaking out, there was not one responsible government authority you could go to. Literally for about 17 hours, Baghdad was a free-fall atmosphere. The Iraqi government let us report precious military intelligence information to the world. And the Iraqis realized that the world knew that Saddam didn't control his airspace. And obviously, if you don't control your own airspace, you're not going to win a war. And that's why they shut us down the next morning and invoked censorship. Jonestown, Guyana, the horror of that story of more than 900 human beings melting in the jungle sun, many of them who were either murdered or committed suicide. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, there I had an emotional interest, aside from being an African American, because we were pals. I had covered his Chicago Fair Housing campaign. And I remember reading the Flash on the air in Chicago at about 6:13, and within 6 hours I was on the streets of Memphis. And covering that story there in Memphis, as they got ready to send his body back to Atlanta, Bobby Kennedy had sent in his turboprop airplane to take the body back, and Mrs. King said she would only let 2 reporters on the plane, Tom Johnson of the New York Times and Bernard Shaw, Group W. Westinghouse. And I was standing by the tarmac crying right next to the hearse that bore his body that was in the casket, because I had been ordered by the news director in Chicago, my boss in Chicago. He had complained to New York headquarters. The cities across the United States were exploding, and there were National Guard troops here in the streets of Washington. And I had been ordered, my boss in Chicago said, "Why are you letting him go to Atlanta? We need him here in Chicago because the damn city's burning down," or parts of the city's west and south sides. So I had to watch his body, his coffin, taken out of the hearse, put into the belly of the plane, and it went up, and the plane taxied away. And as they were airborne, I had to go back inside the terminal at Memphis Airport and catch a plane to Chicago. And I went right to work after I got off the plane in Chicago. Tiananmen Square, I've already mentioned that, so I won't go over that again. But I would say those 3 in particular. There's another one that I can't think of right now.
You let us know when you come back.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Good evening. My name's Mandy. I'm a senior at the George Washington University. I'm sorry to keep harping on this. Now, you discussed briefly with us and gave us a glimpse of your experiences in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Why was that incident such a breakthrough incident for U.S. and journalistic thought, intelligentsia in the West and in the U.S.? Why was that such a breakthrough incident, bringing concerns in China to the forefront of American socio-political thought, rather than previous incidences in Tiananmen that were of a similar caliber?
You're asking why the emphasis, why is that of such interest?
Why was 1989 such a breakthrough incident when things of that...
Wait, I was talking over you. I apologize. Say again, and could you get closer, because I'm barely hearing your question.
Sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Is this better?
That's much better.
Why was 1989 in Tiananmen such a breakthrough incident? It brought concerns in China on a social and political level to the forefront of American journalistic thought and intelligentsia. Why was that incident specifically such a breakthrough incident, rather than previous incidences of a similar caliber that had been occurring in China for decades?
Why?
I'm speaking specifically of, I believe it was 1976.
Yes, I understand. Why? Simply because the world could see it for the first time. You're talking about a communist totalitarian government. And to this day, if you're a journalist, no matter whom you work for, if it's non-Chinese, you catch hell working in that capital of that great country. You do. But the reason why there's such a fixation with Tiananmen Square is that for the first time the world could see it as it actually unfolded. And also, I would submit to you there was a seismic shift in the attitude of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and how it dealt with dissidents. It was extraordinary. The world had a window on what was going on. And for a brief moment, some people naively thought that these students, with the middle class joining in support of them, and comparable, not in number, but attitudinally comparable demonstrations in other cities in China, they thought this was the beginning of a revolution. How wrong they were. Because human beings don't like giving up power, and the old boys in Beijing showed how they could crack down. But still, that the world became aware of Tiananmen is affecting the regime right now and how it relates to the world. That's why it was so important. And it continues resonating. I mean, events make history. Events make history. Just like in this country, this past election debacle on the part of the news media, that was a very historic election we had. The impeachment. Events make history. And that was a seminal moment in the history of the People's Republic of China.
Got the last question. Yep.
My name is Seth Goldman. I'm a freshman at the George Washington University. You mentioned earlier the news media's overabundant coverage of crime and how that's affected stereotypes of African Americans.
Not just African Americans.
Minorities in general.
Not just minorities. It affects people's attitudes. And it's easier for people to think stereotypically.
Well, my question actually relates to that and how, if you think there's been a lack of coverage of, and partially the result of that stereotype, and how that's resulted in the disproportionate arrest and conviction and imprisonment of African Americans and other minorities in the United States, especially during the drug war. And if you think that's been undercovered, and why?
Well, one of the parts of the drug war that I'm glad to see covered now more extensively is the egregious disparity in sentencing between people convicted of using crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And usually the consumers of one differ in economic class. And generally, if I could speak almost too broadly, race too. I'm glad to see that. But in terms of what the scourge of drugs do to our communities, I'm for saturation coverage on both ends, though. Another thing, you're talking about disparity and stereotypes. The news media still undercover white-collar crime in this country. It's almost a crime, the lack of attention newspapers are much better at it, but the lack of attention that influential television networks give to white-collar crime and local television stations. Again, newspapers do a better job of exposing, both locally and nationally, white-collar crime. For some reason, we do not spend the resources to cover white-collar crime. And believe me, white-collar crime in our country is very insidious. It can be just as corruptive as your local drug dealer at a corner.
Bernie, thanks for being so incredibly generous and gracious with the students and with your time.
Thank you.
And now may you tend your garden in good health and happy spirits over many years. And when you get to writing a book, write a Sacco one. And I can't wait to read it.
Well, I don't know about Sacco. It will be honest, and it's not going to please some people.
Really?
Some relatives too, and friends, and colleagues.
Oh, good.
It'll be the truth, though.
I am sure of that. I'm sure of that. If the career of Bernie Shaw has meant anything, it has meant that you're getting the best poop you can right here, and as straight as you can. Also,
I've enjoyed this. This has been inspiring.
This has been great.
It really has.
And I just have a couple of concluding words. And tonight, the George Washington University opened its new building, as you all know, the School of Media and Public Affairs. And I simply wanted to extend my best wishes to a fine university for doing the right thing. My thanks to C-SPAN for being with us tonight, and to the folks at the National Press Club and the George Washington University for helping me with this edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, Executive Director of the Shorenstein Center here in Washington. Thanks so much for being with us. And until next time, good night and good luck.